Hey, welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to be looking at another Apple computer running Linux, and this time it's the 2009 Mac Pro. I've upgraded this to the 2010 firmware. I've also done a bunch of hardware upgrades to it. If you want to see those hardware upgrades, I'll put a link to a couple of videos right up here. It'll take you out to my other channel where I did some upgrade videos on this machine. Now, this video ended up being a little bit long. It's about 15 minutes long, so down in the description, I'll put a index for you that'll take you out to different sections of the video if you want to skip to a section that's important for you. Also, if you want to see anything else on this machine that I don't cover in this video, leave that down in the comment section below. And with all that out of the way, let's get right into this and jump onto the machine. All right, so here we are with our Mac Pro all booted up, and I am going to go ahead and log in here. Now you're going to see that I did some really basic theming here. I'm using the Manjaro distribution with the KDE desktop, and I did some basic theming to kind of make it look Mac OS-esque. That's one thing that's really nice about Linux, is that you can take stuff that you like from other operating systems and set it up in a Linux desktop and kind of make it work and look the way you want it. So let's go right out and look at the system information now that we have a fresh boot here. And we could see our memory usage is less than a gig. It's a little more than half a gig. And that's one thing that I wanted to point out, because in the past, KDE has gotten a very bad rep for being very resource intensive. And that's not the case anymore. It's actually very efficient now. And there's a ton of configurability, which is why I'm using it for this video. But right now we're sitting at less than a gig of our 60 gigs of RAM. So we're doing just fine on RAM. So let's go out and look at some of the system information. We can see here it's showing the version of KDE that we're using. But one thing I wanted to point out is it's showing the processors here, and it's showing our two Xeon X5680s. Now that 24, it's a little confusing because in a lot of operating systems, you would see the core count there. In this case, it's actually showing the thread count. These processors are 6-core, 12-thread processors. I have 2 of them, so there's actually 12 cores, but 24 threads. So that's what's being shown here. Just keep that in mind if something doesn't look quite right when you're looking at your system info. And it's showing just about our 60 gigs of RAM. We can see more info on the RAM usage here. And coming into our devices, we can look at our storage, and we see the NVMe drive that I'm using, that PCIe NVMe card with the NVMe in there, and that's what I installed Linux on. And then this hard drive is just a SATA drive that I have in one of the SATA bays in the tower. So I was using the native controller in the device. Coming down to USB, we can see the USB host controller. Now this is the built-in controller on the tower. It's a USB 2.0, but you can use a PCIe USB adapter to get USB 3. And that's what we got here, where you can see it has the 5,000 megabits per second versus the 480 megabits per second for the built-in controller. So it's significantly faster, and that add-on card works great. I haven't had any problems with it. Again, if you want to see some of these upgrades that I did, make sure you click that video that I mentioned earlier. That'll take you out to my other channel, where I give a full rundown of all the hardware upgrades that I did to this machine. So coming down to network information, right now we're just using the built-in Ethernet controller. It's a gigabit Ethernet. This does support Wi-Fi as well, especially with that Wi-Fi upgrade card that I put in. I honestly don't know if the Wi-Fi is gonna work with the native card or the original card that came in these machines, but that Wi-Fi upgrade, Wi-Fi and Bluetooth upgrade is actually very affordable and pretty easy to do. So I would recommend that one. But this does support Wi-Fi. If we come up into our network settings, come over to Wi-Fi, we can see all our available Wi-Fi connections here. And last but not least, we can see the information on our RX5700, our AMD card that we have in here. And we're just using the open source drivers that are built into the kernel, and they're working awesome. So That is all I have to say about the basic settings. Now let's get into some benchmarking. I did download some synthetic benchmark tools. I don't put a lot of credence into those, but we're going to run through at least two of them in this video. So to run those benchmarking tools, we're just going to jump out to console, which is the terminal application, at least the default one for KDE, and go into downloads. Now I downloaded Geekbench and Unigine Heaven. Geekbench is going to test the compute side, so that, like the processor side, and we're going to use Unigine Heaven to test the GPU performance. So let's get into Geekbench and then run it. Geekbench 5. So this is going to take a while to run. I am going to skip through this and then come back when we get to the results and talk a little bit about those. All right, so Geekbench is all done running. So let's jump out real quick and take a look at the scores. And we can see that they're not all that impressive by today's standards. That single core score of 685, that's pretty slow. But you got to remember, we're talking about some very old processors here. Now, the multi-core score is actually pretty decent, but it's only because we're throwing so many cores at it. That's only slightly higher than I get with my i7-8700K. And we're talking about 12 cores here. So that multi-core score is pretty decent still, but again, it's only because we're throwing so many cores at it. But for a processor that's this old, or processors that's this old in this case, these actually perform pretty well. They're not going to perform like a brand new processor because the technology just wasn't there at the time. So let's go ahead and run Unigine Heaven. So we're going to leave we're going to set the resolution at 1920 by 1080 and leave the quality high and let that run. And let's start our benchmarking. So I'm going to let this run just a little bit to show you what it performs like real time. And then I'll skip to the end. So you don't have to watch this whole thing. I'll skip to the end and we can take a look at the final scores. All right, so here we are with the final results from Unigine Heaven, and we got an average frames per second of 134.6, basically 135, with a minimum of 26.7 and a max of 234. I'm laughing because that min and max are the extreme spikes, and I was sitting here watching it while I was running, and that 134, it was hovering right around there between 130 and 140, so that seems fairly accurate, but that max frames per second, that was just an anomaly basically that spiked up real quick. But we can see that this is a fairly recent GPU on a old machine. This machine is basically 11 years old now, and we're still getting basic scores. I'm going to show you some gaming later that's still possible to do on this computer as well. But that kind of concludes our synthetic benchmarking section. All right, so we did the synthetic benchmarks, but what about actual usage? So just day-to-day usage, navigating around the operating system, bringing files up, stuff like that works just fine. You can watch YouTube videos in 4K. All that stuff works great. Getting into some more advanced stuff, let's talk about video editing. I'm just going to use Kdenlive since we're on Linux here. Let's use a Linux video editor. Although this is available on other operating systems, it is one of the best for Linux. Now you can use DaVinci Resolve in Linux as well. On this machine it doesn't work great, so I'm not even going to show you that. And the next thing I'm going to say is, if you're editing 4K, this is probably not a great choice for you. You can do it, but you have to make proxy files, which takes time to re-encode that into an editing friendly format. If you're just doing 1080p, it works just fine. So I can show you a little bit of that. I just have some basic sample footage. Now, the scrubbing, as you can see, scrubbing through here is not the smoothest thing in the world, but playback is just fine. And then we'll get some video here. Let's just take some from this clip as well. I'm just going to take a random section. And I'll just do a quick transition so you can see how that works pretty well as well. So if we come in here and play this back, So that transition was pretty smooth, and we can go and change that transition to another type. Let's say instead of a wipe, let's do a slide. See what that looks like. And again, that is pretty smooth. Now, like I said, the 4K footage will work. You will be able to edit it, but you're going to have to make those proxy files, which will take some time. Even with those multi-core processors, it's still going to take a while to encode it because, again, these are older processors. So keep that in mind. You can still edit the 4K. You're just going to have to put a little extra time in to re-encode that stuff. So next thing I want to talk about is gaming, and I was actually pretty surprised by this. Again, this has the RX 5700, which is a decent GPU, but this is an 11-year-old machine, and I still had a pretty good experience playing games. Now, on Linux, you obviously can play Linux native games, but you may or may not know that you can play Windows games as well. Well, some Windows games, not all Windows games. There's a bunch of different ways to get this going, but by far the easiest is to do it through Steam Play in the Steam app. So if we launch Steam, I am going to bring up No Man's Sky and show you what that looks like on this machine. Now, this is a Windows game using Steam Play to play it on Linux. So there's many machines that have trouble playing this natively in Windows, and with this, we're translating it so it can play on Linux, and we're playing on an 11-year-old machine here. So let's take a look at what this looks like. I'm just going to load up a previous save that I have here. Now you'll see at the very beginning this gets extremely laggy. You just have to kind of wait for things to settle down, and you do have to reduce some of the graphical settings to get this to run well, but it actually does run pretty well after that. Alright, so like I said, we're a little bit laggy at the beginning. Let's just give it a few seconds for things to kind of load in and settle down a little bit, because we have, fairly decent processors for the time and a decent GPU, but we're still dealing with the system bus on this machine, which is not super fast. So here we are. We are in No Man's Sky on a MacPro, and we're locked up. Okay, so it looks like we're settled down now, and we can go in and change our settings a little bit too. So let's change the graphic options. We're at standard or enhanced right now. We can leave it at that now that things have loaded in, and it looks like we're pretty smooth now. I mean, it's running pretty well. Let's jump into the ship and launch into space just so I can show you what that looks like as well. All right, let's launch and go up into space. We'll see what that transition looks like. And you can see those pauses every few seconds there while it's loading new assets in, and that is a limitation of the system bus. But the fact that it's working this well at all kind of blows my mind. You can see we're up here and we can go back into the planet atmosphere. But you get the idea. So that works pretty well. And then let's take a look at some native Linux games as well. So one game that I have been completely hooked on is City Skylines, but it's not a real good demonstration. It runs really well, but I'm going to load up 7 Days to Die. Now, one thing with 7 Days to Die with AMD cards is there's this speckling graphical issue, but so you're going to see that, but this will give you an idea of how well a game like this will run on this machine. All right, so we're in. I am going to launch the frame counter here. We're at about, it's all over the place. Roughly 30, 40, now that it's kind of, loaded stuff in. I can take a look at our settings, and we're at 1920, 1080, VSync off, and quality. A lot of it's set to ultra and high, so again, setting that lower, we'd get even better frames than this, but already just with those settings, we're you know, now that things have stabilized, we're right around 50-ish frames per second, which is definitely playable in my book. It's a pretty good experience, and a lot of games, you know, graphical games like this will run this well. Now, brand new, modern, you know, AAA titles, you're probably going to have to struggle with. You'll actually still be able to run them, but you'll need to set those settings lower. If you're looking for a gaming machine, I wouldn't necessarily buy one of these, but just to show you the capabilities, along with all the other capabilities of this machine, it's actually pretty capable at playing games. All right, so that's really all I wanted to show you. This wasn't intended to show you every aspect of Linux on this machine, but basically give you an idea of how well it works. I would say if you're somebody that has one of these computers and you're getting sick of how slow Mac OS is on it and the fact that you can't install the newest operating system without patching it, of course, then Linux may be the way that you want to go. Give it a try. It's a relatively easy install. If you want to see a video on that install and enough people want to see that, just let me know in the comment section. I'm happy to do that. One place that this machine absolutely excels at, if you want to set up a powerful Linux server, this is a great machine for that. It's got the 4 internal drive bays. You can add additional fast storage like the NVMe card that I put in there. You can add USB 3.0 or 3.1 cards for fast external storage, and it becomes a fantastic option for a Linux server. So keep that in mind if that's something you're looking at. If you have any questions or comments, leave those in the comment section below. And if you have any requests on additional things you want me to test on this machine, leave that as well. If you haven't subscribed yet, please consider doing so, and I will see you in the next video.